So, welcome everybody. My name is Simon Stevens. I'm the Head of Publications and Events at the Museums Association. I'd like to welcome you all to this MA Northern Ireland members meeting. We're delighted you can join us. This is the first MA Zoom members meeting, and I've got my colleague Rebecca working behind the scenes to make sure all the tech runs smoothly. But as I'm sure you all know, we're all learning to work in new ways and do new things during this pandemic, including this event. So do bear with us if there are any gremlins. I'm sure it'll go smoothly though. We ran our first MA webinar last week, which we're really pleased with, and it ran really well. Some of you may have attended. It was called Coronavirus Conversations, and it looked at leadership in the crisis. And these coronavirus conversations are going to be fortnightly events. Our next one is a week today, and it will look at workforce issues during the crisis. This has another set of great speakers. So if you're interested, please do sign up at the MA website. And a reminder that these online events, including this one, are free for MA members and those who work in institutions that are MA members. So you've hopefully all read the document about getting the best out of this meeting, but just in case, there are a few things, bits of advice before we start. You should all be muted automatically, but if not, please mute yourselves. We have both the chat function and the Q&A function running in this meeting. The chat function is to be used for sort of sharing ideas and web links and thoughts with the group, including the speakers. And the Q&A function is for asking questions directly to the speakers, and I'll keep an eye on that. There is an option if you ask a question to be anonymous, but it would be great if you could say who you are. Also, just a reminder that you can leave and rejoin the meeting at any time. And also a reminder that we're recording the session. And finally, there is a hashtag for this event. If you use Twitter, that hashtag is MA Northern Ireland. So that's it now. Now with all that out of the way, I can introduce our first speaker. She is Maggie Appleton, who is the president of the Museums Association, and she's also the chief executive of the RAF Museum. Welcome, Maggie.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Simon, and a warm welcome to all of you to this Northern Ireland MA members meeting. I do hope you're all keeping well and that today's session will be useful for you. I'm really sorry that I'm not with you in Northern Ireland physically. We were all so much looking forward to all being there together, but I hope it'll be useful to all of us joining, albeit remotely. And I'm really looking forward to today, and particularly hearing the panel discussion later to find out more firsthand about experiences from colleagues here in Northern Ireland. Our focus today, of course, is going to be on COVID-19, but I couldn't begin without mentioning Black Lives Matters. The MA made a statement last week and was part of a joint sector call to proactively support representing our members across the heritage sector, and really acknowledging that our nation's history and heritage is an invaluable tool in the fight against racism and discrimination today. Colleagues in Northern Ireland, of course, know all too well the experiences of contested histories and discrimination. And I think the events of the last fortnight are a reminder to me and all of us that although museums can't fix all of today's ills, we can and do play an important role in bringing communities together, exploring sometimes difficult histories, and being allies with our colleagues, as well as scrutinising our own employment practices. And I think we all need to really reflect on that and back up our warm, supportive words with meaningful actions. And that, of course, means different things to all of us across the sector, which very much runs into today's big theme, in that we are all different and we're all being affected by COVID-19 differently and responding differently. And I've certainly had conversations with colleagues across the four nations over the course of lockdown and noted the similarity and differences. And of course, our complex ecosystem of museums means that we are all in different places in this, and the frustration and tragedy is, of course, that most, I think, acknowledge that museums and the cultural sector is key to addressing the issues that are very live in both our community, helping with that place-shaping agenda to rejuvenate high streets and our communities. And of course, this is another massive challenge to that. I was part of a webinar for my own organisation on Monday, where one of my colleagues used a metaphor she picked up on the radio that said, you know, we hear so many people saying at the moment we're all in the same boat, and that really, really isn't true, either professionally in our organisations or personally. And she used the one that was actually rather we're all in the same storm, but we're in different boats, and we're in different boats of varieties of shapes and sizes and repair and disrepair, some of which have great navigation systems and some of which don't. And I'm so conscious of that, and so conscious that some of my most brilliant creative colleagues are working in a context that's so incredibly challenging. And of course, in the short term, independent museums who charge for entry and rely on all or most of their income from that are literally fighting for survival, and cash flow going off the cliff edge. And that's brilliant and agile colleagues finding ways to go around that, but in an incredibly difficult situation. Some of those museums, of course, have furloughed staff to help. So actually thinking about these things and working as teams is an added difficulty when many of our teams aren't there. And I'm also conscious that some people are working at their desperate hours with the challenges of Zoom and Teams, which have been utterly brilliant. But it's also a very difficult place sometimes sitting in isolation, albeit in your own front room at a desk with your own slippers on. Many colleagues are really not seeing the prospect of reopening till next Easter, because with fewer visitors, even if they can reopen, the constraints mean that it just isn't economically viable for them to open. I was also with some colleagues late last week from local authority or local authority mainly funded museums who were also talking about their crisis may not be in the next week or the next month, but it's certainly coming down the line. And certainly for government, national and locally government funded museums, that concern about ongoing austerity is very real and alive for us. And of course, many of those colleagues too, although some of them won't have furloughed and some local authorities are saying, you know, you can't do that, many of them have got colleagues who are seconded onto other programmes in the local authority, doing great work there, absolutely, but not there to help think how the museum's going through. I'm also really conscious of how, in terms of my theme of everybody and every museum being different, thinking about reopening, we're all affected differently too. We have different locations, we have different shapes and sizes of our museums with different challenges when we reopen in terms of routes round, different transport routes to our museums that also cause a problem too. So we are, all of us, I think, have this playing in our head, and certainly that's the feedback I'm having from colleagues across our 4 nations. Of course, though, our sector's pulling brilliantly together. There's been some great sharing nationally, internationally, which has helped, I think, none of us feel absolutely alone. And seeing what international colleagues are doing, who are 3-4 weeks ahead of us reopening, has been really helpful too. Many of you will know that there are some guidelines being put together at the moment. The Museum Association has had input into those, and there's a group led by the National Museum Directors Council with operations heads from different museums working on those guidelines. They're going to be signed off by DCMS, so of course in England, hopefully next week, but colleagues from National Museums Northern Ireland have been involved too, as have colleagues from Scotland and Wales, so that those principles that will be the same for all of us are being helpfully followed in a consistent way, although of course the timetable across the 4 nations is different, as is our own individual local experience. So, you know, I think I'm back with that very clear message to us all that it's a really difficult time, but I certainly feel heartened and supported by my colleagues in the Museums Association and other sector bodies, and colleagues from across museums, sharing so generously their expertise when they're busy and in their own organisations at the same time, really fighting for survival, some of them. And I guess I really wanted to recognise some of the great work that's been going on in museums despite close down. Seeing some of the content that's coming out online from many of you and colleagues across the sector has been so inspiring. And that's really been driven by that concern for our visitors and users and the public of how we can support them during this time. So knowing that people were there struggling, looking for learning resources, looking for ways to engage their families, museums have stepped up so fantastically to that. So, and also with some incredibly creative events, and certainly our amazing events team at the RAF Museum. We were concerned about them because they put so much creativity into our summer programme that was then just devastated, but they've definitely redirected all their energy into some fantastic programmes. At the same time, of course, people have redirected their energies into thinking about long-term planning and, of course, the planning for reopening, which is a very, very complex task. Equally, some of our museums have also been thinking on the ground, physically still in our locations, how we can work with communities too. Our experience at the Royal Air Force Museum, our Shropshire site, we had a great stock of Easter eggs, yes, chocolate people, but using those for our Easter activities, which we redistributed with our local authorities in Shropshire to people and young people and children in need there as part of the food bank hub. In London, we're actually using our space and have given it over to the local authority to part of our space to use as a food bank hub there. And when I had the joy of going in for the first time on Friday to do a call out, a PR call out for help as a charity, it was delightful because our car park was full, because our police 999 responders next door usually all travel in by the tube, risky business at the moment. So we've just given them a very simple, easy thing to do, is to say, use our car park to enable your people to come in safely. And that sort of work, or carrying on working with our communities and our partners, I see that happening right across the sector. And it makes me feel really be proud to be part of a sector that's putting its arms, perhaps virtually rather than physically, around each other and around our communities at the moment. I think all of us are also, and I hope all of us are really conscious that our people who work in our museums, of course, they need to be at the heart of that recovery. But everyone, again, is in a really different place. And I'm very conscious in my organisation that every conversation I have with colleagues and every single decision we make, whether it's about what's happening now during the closed period or about reopening, it lands differently depending on where each of us is at the moment in our lives and in our personal spaces. Everybody hears the same message through a very different prism and reacts and feels differently about it. I became aware of that, I think, on the first day that we'd actually closed to the public, and we were working really hard to get as many people as possible working from home. And a chat started on our online teams that we got brought up, and we're beginning really early on. And a chat started amongst people about, you know, what animals they'd got helping them at home with their work. And I was just feeling really joyful because I was concerned about some colleagues who were working from home and were feeling lonely, feeling jolly and joyful about that chat. And someone added to the chat who was actually in our museum, keeping our museum safe, and saying how hard that was for her to hear about when she was there in the museum. And I think it landed really clear with me from day one that we're all in that very different space. We've certainly been working hard to put in place many of the measures that I know many of you have. So we've got a dedicated museum at home page on our intranet site, and we were lucky because we've been working on an intranet site and literally had got it up and running only about a couple of months before lockdown. We're now doing a weekly bulletin for everyone with news flashes, letting everyone know what's happening. People are dropping into each other's meetings using our online team system. And, you know, some of our teams are just doing some amazing creative things for their people, saying, no talk about work, bring a cup of tea, and we're actually just going to have some fun and some chat. And I'm sure that's going on everywhere, and people are really appreciating it. We've been trialling these webinars ourselves and have now got weekly ones, keeping people in touch with reopening. And of course, we're all of us thinking about those people that don't have online access, which is another massive barrier for people, with telephone trees and checking and making sure people are okay. I know that many of you will have volunteers as well, and many of whom you'll be concerned about, as I am. Some of whom are shielding and older people, but some younger ones as well. And I think almost all of them really commit to volunteering for our museums as part of their social life, and some of them absolutely rely on us for the joy. So us really focusing on them has been important too. And certainly our online programs that we've got for staff, we've been extending those for our volunteers as well. So I know all of us have been thinking about that and thinking about our people during this time. And, you know, I think if we have one message from all this, it's that we are all in the same storm. And yes, we're all in different boats, ships of different sizes. But what we can do is support each other and throw out whether it's a lifeboat or a rubber dinghy, or even the little rings we all used to wear in the swimming baths when we were little. We should all be offering support to each other at this time. I'm really conscious of how exhausting and draining this is for so many people, but what I'm also absolutely clear about is the resilience in our sector, our absolute genuine passion for our collections, and how we can use them in positive, supportive ways to make people's lives better and change lives for the better. And through that, we will learn from this and we will come out stronger, most of us at least. The Museums Association has been feeling all of this as a charity and for the sector that we represent. And the MA has been really clear about its priorities from the start, and its priorities have been, as I've said, for all of us, its staff. Its priorities have been for its membership, all of you, and its third priority, of course, is about our resilience as the MA, as a charity, because if we fall over as a charity, we cannot look after you as our membership and look after our staff. So I'd just like to take my hat off to Sharon Hill and Simon and all the MA team for caring so much about the sector and putting your hearts and souls into this. I'm going to hand over now to Sharon to talk a little bit more about how the MA's responded, and I know that she'll then be passing on to Alistair to say a few more words. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thanks so much, Maggie. That was fantastic, and the support that the sector's been giving each other in these times, it has been very inspiring. So thanks for joining us, Maggie. Maggie will be back later. After we hear from Sharon and Alistair, we'll have a little Q&A session, so do pop your questions in the Q&A function if you'd like to ask Maggie or Sharon or Alistair anything. So next up we have Sharon Hill, who's the Director of the Museums Association, and Sharon is going to talk about the impact of coronavirus and what the MA and the sector and how it's been responding. So over to you, Sharon.
Thanks, Simon, and hello to everybody in Northern Ireland and possibly in Ireland as a whole who's joining us here today. I completely echo Simon and Maggie's comments about wishing we were in Belfast. It's a very rainy day in London where I'm zooming in from, and I would much prefer to be in Belfast. I remember when we were all there together for the conference just a couple of years ago, and what an amazing event that was. I'm just going to crank up a presentation, hopefully, that you'll be able to see. And following on from Maggie, talk about what our priorities have been as a Museums Association and how we came to those priorities, actually. So I think the same as a lot of museums, we had to make swift and sometimes difficult decisions as a result of the pandemic and the lockdown. Just about a week before the lockdown happened, there were a couple of us, members of the senior management team in Edinburgh. We were there to help prepare for our conference at the end of this year. And at the end of a long day, we were debating in the pub, naturally, that if we had to close the Museums Association office, what would that look like? How would we cope? What would it be like for all staff? Could we ensure that we could work at home and serve our members in the wider sector? And it felt a bit theoretical, and yet within days we were putting our plan into action. And I know, as Maggie has outlined, it's been exactly the same for everybody. These are, and it's a cliche, unprecedented times. Every single museum in the whole of the UK shut to our public, who we absolutely want to get back through our doors when it's safe to do so. We were fortunate at the MA in that all our staff can work from home. In fact, probably for all of us in the sector and more widely in society, this pandemic is going to mean there's going to be new ways of working, and some of that might be positive. There might be some flexibility. There might be a better work-life balance for some of us as a result of that. And I think when times are so challenging, we have to hold on to some of the good stuff, and we definitely need to do the learning and understand the legacy of this pandemic, its impact on us as individuals and its impact on our museums and our communities, importantly. And we also know that many institutions weren't set up for working at home, and that many staff can't work from home. They can't do their jobs from their home residence. And we've tried to take all that into account in our lobbying, in our advocacy, in the support that we've put together for the sector. So, as Maggie said, we outlined for ourselves 4 basic priorities. And the first one was our staff welfare. And I hope every museum thought this first when they were thinking about their response to the pandemic, because without our staff, we can't deliver any of the amazing things we do as museums or as the Museums Association. So every organisation will have gone through the same process, rolling out emergency plans, but also trying to understand what's happening in society when you face a unique, once in a generation, hopefully, challenge. And hopefully what we've done has been reflected across the sector, and I certainly see it in the way that museum directors from all sorts of institutions have talked about how much they want to look after their staff, engage with their staff and keep in touch with them over this difficult period, and how much they value the role of their staff. We did have to think about business continuity. We have to keep the Museums Association going. We've existed for a very long time, and we want to exist in the future to support all of our fantastic museums. So we had to think about what we can do to ensure that we have enough resources and capacity to support you as a sector. We are entirely funded by our business model, which is about membership. We don't get any public funding from elsewhere. So it's absolutely important for us that you, our members, support us as an organisation so that we can then support you in turn. And we've supported our members through a range of online events and CPD and workforce support, which I'll talk a little bit more about, but hopefully other speakers will address that as well. And we do have to support the wider sector. We recognise not everybody's a member of the Museums Association, but we're here to support all museums and to make the case for funding and resource and capacity for all museums. And it might sound like we had that plan on a peg and we just rolled out our pandemic plan, but of course we didn't, and we weren't expecting this. And what we did was go back to our mission, our vision, and our values. You probably all know our mission is inspiring museums to change lives. We went right back to that and our vision for inclusive and participatory museums at the heart of their communities. And we went into our values around inclusivity, diversity and equality. And that's really helped guide us to give you an offer that we hope will support you. And I know that many, many museums, after at first probably having the same panic that everybody did about how you close a museum, how you secure the collection, how you make sure staff are safe and looked after, and think about that public offer being completely contained and reined in, many, many museums then put their heads up and took a pause and said, how do we get through this? And we get through this by thinking about what our values are, what our mission is, and what our vision is. And I think that if they're right, they'll be right in a pandemic, and they'll be right on the other side of a pandemic. And that's absolutely critical in terms of thinking about where you sit in society when there's huge upheaval, massive challenges and change. So what have we offered? Lots of you will already have seen Museum Essentials, our online learning course. We've got thousands of people signed up to that now. We've got a couple of modules on ethics and on collections, and we've got waiting in the wings a module on partnership, which is something we're going to have to really focus on when reopening comes, because we need to, hopefully we'll have sustained those partnerships during lockdown, but we'll really need to regenerate them and make new partnerships, work hard with communities to bring people back into our institutions, because people are going to be frightened, people are going to be risk averse, and people are going to be thinking about their families' health and safety, and we need to be able to link with them and reassure them that we are safe places to come into, and that they can really have an enjoyable experience within our walls and be safe. As a membership organisation, we do represent over 13,000 individual members, as well as 1,500 museums, and that's everything from volunteer-run museums, which I know you have some in Northern Ireland and Ireland, to the nationals. And it's really important to have that mix, as well as the mix of people from volunteers and trustees, front of house, back of house, learning and engagement and curatorial. It's really critical that we are able to serve that really diverse, broad range of people who work in museums. And the reason that that's important is because we want to be collaborative and collegiate, and we want to work with all of our colleagues across a range of museums, but also because it helps us make a powerful case to government and a powerful case to funders and those that we need to support us. So just this morning I was on a phone call with the National Museum Directors Council and the Department for Culture in England, talking about that reopening guidance that Maggie talked about. But because I'd had a prior phone call with Sinead from the Museums Council, I was able to feed in some of the experience here in Northern Ireland and say, get that guidance out as quickly as possible, because museums on the ground really need it. And if there's an earlier opening date in Northern Ireland or in any of the other nations, it's needed now more than ever. So we've been able to put a fair amount of hope in place for our members. As I mentioned on workforce, in addition to Museum Essentials, our online training, we have career conversations. A lot of this has been hosted and run by Tamsin Russell, our professional development officer, who's done an absolutely stellar job supporting the sector and coming up with new and innovative ways to support the workforce. We also have the essential mentoring and leadership mentoring, and I hope you'll have seen the Facebook furlough group, which I think has over 350 members, and Tamsin will be able to give more details on that. But workforce is really important. What our members mean to us and what our workforce mean to museums is that ability to connect, to tell stories, to engage, and to really bring the collections and the objects alive. We've also put out a lot in terms of resources for our members online. So we have their existing toolkits and frameworks, as well as targeted content for these times in terms of news and practice. Maggie mentioned the statement that we made about Black Lives Matter in conjunction with other sector organisations, but we're updating the news on a regular basis. Please do sign up for our newsletters, which come out 3 times a week, and that will give you all of the capacity that you need in terms of being able to understand, hopefully, what's happening to us. There is also resource in terms of museum practice. So as soon as that reopening guidance is out, and it will be simultaneously published across different sector organisations. We'll analyse that, we'll summarise that, we'll digest it, we'll try and break it down so that you can understand what the things are that you need to put in place in order to reopen. And it might be that some staff in the sector have got more time because of furlough, so now's a good time to think about your professional development, to dig in and think about all the issues that are pertinent to our sector at the moment and look for those resources on our website. But also it might be that you've been asked to take on extra things in your workplace because others have been furloughed, and you might have to look for the resources and the support that you need in order to carry out those tasks. So we've also, as several have mentioned, developed, this is just an example of, for example, podcasting. We have online some practical information about how you might up your digital content, including podcasting, as part of the things that we've put out there and the content that we've put out for the sector. We've also developed our online content in terms of the webinars that we talked about and the coronavirus conversation. So we'll be carrying all of that on. And I was really struck last week when we did our first coronavirus conversation, how honest the leaders that we talked to were. So that was Maggie, our president, Gillian Finlay, our vice president, and Nathaniel from Charleston House, a small independent museum. And people were really honest talking about the challenges that we face, but also if we share those challenges, we might be able to come up with solutions. And I think that's one of the things that we can be as the Museums Association, a platform for sharing the challenges, but also sharing some of the solutions as well. And we've rooted that in our values, as I say, and part of that is the Code of Ethics. That's our values system as an organisation, but also for the sector. And one of the first things we did was publish our guidance on contemporary collecting during the pandemic. Of course, lots of museum people will have thought what we need to do is collect. We need to get the social history and the evidence of this pandemic into our institutions. But obviously we need to be careful in how we do that. And the question is, how do we do that ethically and responsibly with our communities so that we make sure we don't just end up with a lot of stuff that other organisations also have? And how can we do it with sensitivity and respect? How can we make sure, for example, when that passes through into an issue like Black Lives Matters, that we are sensitive and respectful of all the issues that surround that, as Maggie referred to. Bristol Museum has pledged to collect the protest placards from Black Lives Matters after the toppling of the statue there at the weekend. And that feeds directly into our work as an organisation on decolonisation. Because whilst we've provided the extra support for the sector, and I hope that's been aspirational and inspirational and practical and has given you the tools that you need, we also carry on our day-to-day policy work as well. So we have a decolonisation working group which is working on guidance, which we hope to bring out to the sector over the course of this year. And it was humbling actually to be at a meeting of the working group for that project earlier last week, to hear colleagues talk about their responses and feelings on the Black Lives Matter protests and how museums might respond to it. So I think we can again be that platform for dialogue and debate and discussion, sometimes difficult issues, sometimes challenging issues, but bring that into the forum and air those views. And what we also do is provide funding support. So we, as many of you know, run the Esme Fairbairn Collections Fund, and we'll be able to explain more about that later. But as soon as the lockdown happened, we thought, how can we support the sector? What are the ways in which we can enact our support for the sector? And we asked the trustees of the Collections Fund if we could divert money to an emergency response. And we tested the idea with people throughout the UK and developed the Sustaining Engagement with Collections Fund. And we didn't know if that would fly. We put the call out for applications, we made it light touch, and it's about exactly what it says on the tin. How do you sustain engagement with your collections during a lockdown as part of a pandemic. We set aside 350k for grants of up to 30k, and we were absolutely overwhelmed by the response. We had 140 plus applications, and many of them of a really high quality and calibre. So it made it difficult to make the decisions about who got funded, but it's obviously hit a real need. And as part of it, we worked with the Art Fund and the Heritage Fund to try and ensure that if we can't fund all of those applications, and we can't, that they can possibly find support elsewhere, and we can pass them on to those organisations. And also to make sure we've got alignment in the funding, to make sure we're not duplicating other funding sources and that there are no gaps. And the other funding that we deliver is through the Benevolent Fund, and we are going to make an announcement about that funding for individuals who are facing hardship over the course of the next few weeks. And the last point that I'll finish on is that critical point of advocacy. We've worked with lots of other sector organisations to make the best case for emergency funding in the first instance, and then for that continued support that we know that we will need. We've worked with other organisations on the reopening guidance. This image is from Germany, and showing the social distancing measures that have been put in place there to reopen museums. We've learned from colleagues internationally, and we've supported the development of the guidance. And I'll finish on this point. Museums will reopen. They'll look and feel a bit different, and the way that we work in them will feel different. But what we will continue to do as a Museums Association is support institutions and support staff and support our members to make sure we can continue to document, record, work with our communities to understand what's happened and to hopefully understand what the future might hold. Thank you for your support.
Thanks so much, Sharon. That was a great whistle-stop tour of all the things that the MA is doing during these very, very difficult times. Another key part of our role is advocacy. And next up, we have Alistair Brown, who's the Policy Manager at the Museums Association. And Alistair is going to be talking about our advocacy work. So welcome to you, Alistair.
Hi guys, hello. So yeah, lovely to be here on the call, and as Sharon and Maggie said, just such a shame that we can't actually be with you guys in Northern Ireland. And I guess I just want to speak very briefly, picking up on some of what Sharon has spoken about already, in terms of what we've been up to in terms of advocating for the sector in Northern Ireland, and then also just sharing some thoughts about what you can do in your local context to really prepare for some of the challenges ahead. So let me just share my screen with you. Okay. Go. So yeah, I mean, I just thought I'd pick up a bit to start with on all the things that the MA has been doing to make the case for the sector during the current crisis. And as I said, I want to talk a bit about firstly what the MA has done to support museums in Northern Ireland, and then second, what you can do in your organisations to make the case for the sector. So to start with, what's the MA been doing for museums in Northern Ireland? We're just digging a little bit deeper into the advocacy work that we've been doing. We've obviously been talking a great deal with politicians and civil servants who have been making decisions on a very quickly, and trying to make sure that they're making decisions that are right for the sector. So I think particularly during the sort of the initial period of the coronavirus crisis, we saw a lot of very, very substantial decisions being made, which we were able to, which I think we were at least partially able to influence. Things like the ensuring that the furlough scheme was extended, that there was an equivalent furlough scheme for freelancers, and so on. So we talked to a lot of people in government about prolonging the furlough scheme, ensuring that there was flexibility for furloughed staff, and really improving the financial help that was available to freelancers as well. So we've been making sure that the sector is well represented in those discussions, and we're certainly now, as you've heard from Sharon, working with government in Westminster and across all the nations to look at what reopening guidance is needed for the sector. So we're confident that we've got a really good document coming up, and should be published in the next week. And we're also talking now about how we can get the best package of support available for museums as they move into this kind of new phase that is no longer kind of the emergency phase, but is the recovery and reopening phase for the sector. So lots of discussions about that going on at the moment. We're also very conscious that it's not just government departments and civil servants that want to know what's going on. There's also a lot of scrutiny of government happening in the various parliaments and assemblies around the country, and we've been busy providing evidence to parliamentary committees in England, Scotland, and Wales. We need to think about how we do that appropriately in Northern Ireland as well. We've been doing lots of work with the media, and we've had some really good coverage for museums and for the plight of museums in recent weeks. We've just been quoted in an article in The Economist magazine. We've been on Sky News, on BBC News. We've had pieces placed in other major newspapers as well. So that's been really important. That's something that we can do to really highlight how museums in particular are being impacted by the crisis, and thinking about and making sure that it's in the public consciousness that this is something that is that we really need to be taking seriously at the government level. So we've also been working with funders to clarify eligibility for emergency funding. I know that lots of museums at first weren't sure what pots of money they were allowed to go for. There's a lot of confusion, I think, about whether organisations should be going for heritage funding or for different pots of funding. So we've worked closely with them to sort some of those issues out. We also worked very closely with the BBC right at the very beginning of the crisis to think about how museums could make sure that they were visible in all the work that the BBC was doing in response to the crisis. Some of you, I'm sure, will have seen some of the programmes around museums in quarantine that were broadcast on BBC4. And we also worked and we also supported an online day to museums from home, which lots of you will have participated in, and which was, I think, really a really successful day. We've just seen some initial figures back from that day, and it's clear that tens of thousands of people were logging onto the website and participated in Twitter. The BBC were really, really pleased with the involvement that they've got. So hopefully that's the basis for a future partnership, and something that you should keep an eye out for more info on in the coming months. We have our FAQs on the website for any organisations that are looking for support, and then Sharon, and then a couple of other things that Sharon mentioned earlier, the Sustaining Engagement with Collections Fund, which you're going to hear more about later as well, and the statement that we put out on contemporary collecting during the pandemic. So lots of stuff going on. Our aim ultimately is to make sure that the government is making the right decisions, and to make sure that the profile of the sector and the concerns of the sector are being listened to. You know, I think so far we're doing a reasonably good job, but obviously there's still a lot more to do, particularly around that issue about recovery and reopening, and making sure that we don't really face a cliff edge when the furlough scheme ends, and once organisations are being asked to reopen, because we're well aware of the many issues that museums face beyond that point. So that's a little bit about what we've been up to. But obviously, you know, we really recognise the scale of the challenge ahead for the sector, and we know that in lots of your organisations you'll have very serious financial issues ahead, which really no one could have predicted a few months ago. And actually, you know, we can do some of this high level stuff on behalf of the sector, but in every institution, ultimately, everybody needs to up their advocacy game in the next few months in order for museums to really prove their value to gather public support. You know, we've been here. Unfortunately, we've been here before in the recent past with lots of the challenges that we've faced around the austerity agenda over the last 10 years, and ultimately, it's time to think about how we pull some of the things that we learned from that period out of the cupboard and take that forward again. So I just want to think at this stage a little bit about how you can advocate for your museum in the current context. You know, what are the issues that you need to be thinking about as issues around funding rear their head in the weeks, months, maybe years to come. And ultimately, these what I've done here is to pull together some questions that I think it's really useful for you to ask yourselves about how you can advocate for your museum. So, I mean, advocacy and advocating and advocacy can seem a bit jargony, but ultimately, advocacy is just about speaking up for yourselves. It's making sure that you're noticed, that you're valued, that your museum and that you are appreciated for the work that you do. So these are questions that are, I think, always worth asking, but really never more so than in a time of crisis. Firstly, it is in terms of assessing where you are and who's important to your organisation. The first thing that's really important to do is just think about, well, who are the people with power to make decisions about my organisation? So who are your kind of in advocacy speak, you know, who are your key stakeholders? That might be internally your director and your trustees. Externally, it might be local authority councillors, your local MP, volunteer groups, friends groups, that kind of thing. It's really important to, I think, take a bit of time internally in your organisation to really map those out. Who are all those groups, and and how do they relate to each other, and think about how they interact and who is a particular priority for different types of decisions. So I think that's a really useful thing to start off by doing. Who are the people who make decisions? Who are the people that we ultimately need to care about? And then working back from that is doing a kind of a fairly frank assessment. Is my museum's work widely recognised? Is it valued as being important? And then do those people that you've highlighted before, the people who have power to make decisions about your museum, do they think it's important? And I think it's really useful to be quite honest about this. You know, imagine what the public would say if your organisation were to be closed down, God forbid, or if there were to be cuts to the opening hours or whatever. And if that was to happen, who would be the people that you could count on? Who would speak up for you? Who would you need to persuade that a different course of action needed to be taken? So I think about that and be honest about it. And once you've got to that stage, then you can really take action to improve your position. So the final question here, as you can see, is how then can I improve the perception of my museum's work? So how can my organisation really be as visible as possible? And this can be a whole host of different things. It depends entirely on your museum's context. But some of the really key and obvious things might be improving your local press coverage, so making sure that there's stuff out there in the press about your work, about the positive things that you've been doing, making sure that you're regularly sharing information with those key stakeholders. So do you tell your local authority about your exhibitions, or in the current context about some of the work that you've maybe been doing online, and how people have engaged with that, or other things that the museum has been doing to adapt to the current crisis. Building partnerships with others. So I know that lots of museums have worked closely with their local NHS or with other local care providers during recent times. But of course, you know, it's important to think about the work that you were doing pre-coronavirus crisis as well. Showing that you can bring in things like external grant funding is really important. So if you have been able to do that, then that's something that's really valuable and worth highlighting. It's certainly something that local authorities, councillors love to see. And then finally, I think demonstrating how your work fits into wider narratives or wider government priorities, for example, or local authority priorities. And that's where things like Museums Change Lives Northern Ireland really fit in. So some of you will be familiar with the Museum Change Lives Northern Ireland document that we published earlier this year. And this is a document that's based on the Museums Change Lives campaign that the MA has been running for many years. But this focuses specifically on case studies of really great socially impactful work that has been taking place in Northern Ireland. And I think that using a document like this, sharing it with your key stakeholders, talking about how your work fits into this idea, this vision is really important. I'll put the link for the Museum Change Lives Northern Ireland on the chat in a moment, and I think then it would be really good to hear some questions, comments from the group, and I'm sure that Sharon and Simon and I and Maggie will be able to hopefully respond.
Thanks so much, Alistair. Yes, sorry, we are overrunning slightly, just to prove that sort of Zoom life is not so much different from physical life. So we're going to miss out the questions at the moment, and there might be time at the end to ask some questions. So now we're going to go straight to hear from Sally Colvin, who is the Programmes Manager at the MA, and Sally is going to talk to us quickly about the Esme Fairbairn Collections Fund. So welcome to you, Sally.
Good afternoon, everyone. I will be quick, Simon, thank you. At the MA, I look after the programmes we run, so that's collections, workforce, partnership, for example, and that's with the aim of delivering the MA's vision for museums and supporting the work that you do. So as Sharon and Maggie have described, we've been busy adapting what we do in response to coronavirus, and along the way really trying to understand what those various impacts are on the museum sector. My job today is to tell you what we've done with the Collections Fund, what we've learned and what our next steps are. The big change that Sharon's mentioned is that we've diverted £350,000 from our usual grants to create sustaining engagement with collections grants. We're midway through awarding those, so you can't apply for them any longer, I'm afraid, but hopefully next week we'll be able to announce who the successful grantees are. Those grants are up to 30k for activity within the year from award. And across the suite, we are looking to award a series of projects that are variously ambitious and innovative, given the scale of the museums that are applying. We do understand that what's innovative for one museum isn't necessarily innovative for another. Largely, we expect to support online engagement, but not exclusively. And we're interested in projects that might bring in freelancers or technology that gives something new to a museum. Now, given that our funding is not that big, our fund is not that big, rather, then we see these grants as being support for maybe 15 or so museums that have probably secured their immediate survival and want to take the opportunity to creatively rebuild what they offer and work towards reopening. As Sharon said, we've been overwhelmed by interest and we've had 145 applications in total. That's probably twice as many as I expected to get at the outset. So that means it's been an intense period where we've learned a lot about need and what we can do to support museums, even if they haven't been successful in getting a grant from us. So a few of those standout points are something like 80% of the applications we received are perfectly good fundable projects, and maybe 20% of the total are really excellent ideas. But we're currently in a position to award grants to only about 10% of the applications. So we're looking into options to fund more of the project, if we can, and just a few, and we'll work with other funders like our fund to share ideas and projects that we really rate to the funding streams that they've got. Of the 145 applications, 36% were primarily to digitise collections and present them online. 46% were to produce some kind of audiovisual interpretation of collections, like virtual tours or films. And what that tells us is that a lot of museums want to do very similar things. So there must be some economy of learning and effort in doing that work together, or perhaps even as part of a dedicated fund that aims to get spread across the whole sector. So we'll share our findings with sector bodies and funders as advocacy for what the sector needs. But it's also worth saying that this relates back to some of the recommendations in the Empowering Collections report about needing a combination of kind of creative solutions and infrastructure for online collections. There were other themes that came out in the applications. I was surprised, for example, by some of the applicants who seemed quite fixed on a technology that they wanted to use to reach audiences online without necessarily much evidence of what their target audiences want, or particularly for this fund, how that's based on the particular strengths in their collection. I mean, I'm being a bit glib, but if a couple of years ago people just wanted an app, now they might just want a podcast. And that might be the right solution, but how do you know? I was also surprised by how many applications were limited in their scope, in the sense that they didn't address income generation or how work with audiences online now will relate to reopening down the line. Overall, I think that's probably just a feature of timing. And if museums reflect in the coming months on the applications that they've put together, I think they'll probably refine and make slightly different arguments. On that point, our next grant funding round is the 14th of September for Collections, Innovation and Engagement grants. And they're our 90k kind of medium-sized grants projects that can last over a couple of years. So the next challenge for us will be to help you, the museums that want to apply, to use what you've learned in lockdown and perhaps in the process of reopening, if you're going to be able to in the next few months, to shape slightly bigger ideas with slightly more context to go into that fund. Certainly there's masses of interest, so I'll finish, I'll be quick, I'll finish with a plea to think of us for funding and to chat to us as you develop your ideas. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sally, that was great. Next up, you've already heard Sharon talk a bit about the great work Tamsin's been doing with our professional development work. So now to hear a bit more, you've got Tamsin herself to speak to you. Welcome, Tamsin.
Welcome. Thank you very much. And I'm conscious of time. I have a range of slides that I'll share with you in one moment, but I'll also be able to send those to you as well. So if you need to have access to more detailed information, you can get that after the event. So let me just share the slides. And as Simon has just said, we have already covered some of the content, so that enables me to canter quite quickly through the rest. So this is all around professional development, and I thought what would be really helpful first of all is just really to articulate where I think we need to be coming from. So there absolutely is a need, so a requirement as a function of reopening and our learning from COVID around unlearning existing procedures and then learning new ones. And the reason I want to emphasize that is that has a significant impact on your cognitive capacity to work in a new way of working. And sometimes people don't appreciate the impact that has. So when you go back into either working from home if you have been furloughed, or you go back into your institution, you are going to have to unlearn a lot of those procedures that have been rote for many years, and that takes energy itself. So be kind to yourself. And then there is something about learning new ones, which takes additional energy. Within all of this, I spoke to a friend that was unfurloughed on Monday, and she said she was really anxious about going back into work. She'd forgotten her passwords, and it was something really, really trivial, but she said that really wobbled her for the rest of the day. So there's something also about thinking around your professional development in terms of you're going to have to relearn some of the things that perhaps if you've not been doing that part of your role, or you've not been in the organisation doing that part of the role, means you're going to be a little bit more I suppose, stayed around it. There is something bigger than all of this, though, and we've already alluded to that in terms of the changes to the sector more broadly, and that means some short-term skills that we might need to develop in terms of either new processes or sort of responsive or reactive skills around exhibitions, and exhibitions being online. But also we might need to think about longer-term skills in terms of how we begin to engage more broadly with different audiences as a function of this. I think what the situation does afford us sometimes is some space. So that enables us to think differently. It may enable us to focus on things that are important to us. You know, certainly through my career conversations with people have begun to think about what's really important, what's their perspective around their careers and their work-life balance has changed. So this has afforded individuals an opportunity to really think around what's important to them. And for some, it also has afforded them time to be able to do that. So whether individuals' roles have sort of been squished, or whether you found yourself on furlough, not that there's a requirement to do lots of professional development by any means, but certainly some people have said that time has enabled them to think about professional development in a different way. And specifically as a distraction from a lot of this. So people have been able to do some deep dives and some work, or areas that perhaps they've always wanted to know more about but have never had the time to do so. I did a presentation last week for the Heritage Volunteer Group during Volunteers Week, very supportive of volunteers in the workplace. Also about this as an opportunity to step out, to step up. So organisations are working more quickly, they're more agile, they want innovative solutions, and that really is an opportunity for all of those people that have said, oh, if only we could do this. This is your opportunity to make that suggestion. You may find that the organisation is more receptive, you may find that there's less scrutiny in terms of your actions, which means you can make and affect change more readily, which is all part of the Museums Change Lives agenda. Next slide. Our programmes, and I'm not going to talk too much about these, around Museums Essentials, the AMA and the FMA, these are our core programmes. So we have lots of different programmes, working ethically, working with collections, and as Sharon has said, working in partnerships. So please, if you have yet to sign up, do so. In terms of our other core programme, the AMA, we've got a number of people doing the associateship in Northern Ireland. It is still business as usual, but with an enhancement. So I'm not going to read through the slide, but very much this is an opportunity for you to think about your professional practice in the round. So this is about you being a well-rounded museum professional and being able to make contributions to the sector. And there is a very clear development framework to support you. So you're not doing this alone, even though it's self-directed and you might find yourself doing this at home or working from home. We have a really good wraparound support network and framework to help you develop. Just in terms of numbers, 3 years, 360 quid, 12 months, 153 mentors, 13 AMA support groups, one of which is in Northern Ireland, and currently we have 260 candidates going through all of this. The other aspect of our core programme is our FMA. This is a single slide, but this is for those individuals that are looking to either recognise significant and advanced contribution to the sector already, or are looking to develop around these competency headings. So leadership, advocacy, thank you, Alistair, for talking about all of those skills associated, people development, and then also self-development, a really core component of our fellowship approach. The mentoring programs that we've talked about are all still live. So if you're interested in having any of these, look at the focus in terms of careers, leadership, or technical or professional skills, drop me an email and we can get you mentored and paired up literally by the end of the day. And then finally, because I'm conscious of time, really wanted just to highlight the Museum Furlough Group. So this was established just over 2 weeks ago. We now have 375 members. It is open to anybody, and that means members or non-members. So for those of you that know people in the sector that may have been furloughed but aren't Museum Association members, we welcome them hugely. We have different days. I like alliteration. And this is just some of the examples of some of the really high-tech graphics we have been adopting. So on Monday, it's all about motivation. So this is a particular theory around motivation, around the relationship between satisfaction and motivation. Task Tuesday, we focused on people reflecting on the emotions they were experiencing, because to identify your emotions enables you to articulate them and then enables you to work through them either with your loved ones or with your line manager in terms of what this whole process is bringing up. Wellbeing Wednesday is all about support. So today we talked about building resilience and have yet to decide what we'll be thinking about tomorrow. And Fun Friday usually involves a gift or some sort of recipe exchange. But really wanted to highlight that if anybody has been furloughed or anticipating going in or out or being part-time furloughed, this also is a really good network to be part of. That brings me to the end of my presentation. I will stop sharing my screen shortly. Happy to answer questions or hear suggestions in the chat function. And back to you, Simon.
Thanks so much, Tamsin. Thanks for whizzing through, because it's great. We do want time for our final 4 speakers who will be joining us now. So we have Jenny Heslett, who's the Museum Manager at the Northern Ireland War Memorial. We have Elaine Hill, the Heritage Development Officer at Mid and East Antrim Borough Council. Both Elaine and Jenny are MA reps. We'll also have Sinead McCartan, who's the Director of Northern Ireland Museums Council. And we've also got Catherine Thompson, who's the Chief Executive of National Museums Northern Ireland. So we're just waiting them to join now. Each of them are going to speak in turn, and they're going to talk about the challenges created by the coronavirus for them, their museums and the sector, and how they're sort of staying engaged with communities. So we've got Sinead and Catherine, Jenny, and we're all there, and Elaine as well. Thanks for joining, everyone. You all okay?
Mm-hmm. Good, yeah. Okay.
Great, thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks for taking the time. So I think we were going to go in alphabetical order by first name. So Elaine, you're up first, if that's okay.
Okay, sure. Hello, everybody. So just briefly, what it's sort of been like from a council, local authority, museum perspective. We, I suppose, are fortunate we're not dependent on visitor income or an entrance fee or volunteers. So we have had council-led support in the transition for working from home. After the first few days, we got networked onto systems, and that has really helped be able to access information from the museum and from our files from home. As a team of 4 at Mid Antrim Museum, we've had one person redeployed right from the very beginning of working from home, and she's been employed in community response for council. We also had one person furloughed just at the start of this month, so we're down to 2 people or 50% within our own museum. Across the service, where we have 2 other museums, there's 7 staff, so total of still 1 redeployment and 2 people furloughed. So we are working at a bit of a reduced capacity. However, we have adapted across the service, looking at where we can prioritise tasks and scale back on other projects which maybe weren't so much of a priority. So we really were focusing all of our efforts on virtual content and developing that, sometimes in line with the local audiences that we had already worked with, and also identifying other wider initiatives that we could link into to give us a bit more spread. We've been working through our council communications team for that, so they've been supporting us and putting stuff on social media for us. One of the other things we have been maybe increasingly involved in is supporting civic events across council, which have gone from being events to virtual commemorations, for example, VE Day, and there's a few others as well. So we've got a role within that as well. So really, as across the 3 museums, we have been collaborating quite well. I would say sort of access to our systems, we did do a training through NMC with Collections Trust, so access to our actual database is very slow. So unfortunately, for myself anyway, collections access is poor on that respect, but we're still trying to use the collections, and unfortunately we had a lot of documentation that we can still use. In terms of trainings, as I said, there's been a few online training events organised which have been very useful. Also as well for ourselves, we've been able to continue dementia works with dementia groups through the Love to Move programme supported by the Museums Council, and that was something that was a pilot programme, and we're midway through the sessions at the minute. Something we're very conscious of longer term is that we'll probably use these virtual activities and programmes for a longer period of time, even when we're back in the building. And I think, as we mentioned before, we're very aware that not everybody can join in on Zoom or via technology without support. And we are aware that some people who we had targeted because they were socially isolated when they could come into the museum aren't picking up on some of the programmes that we're delivering. So that's something that we will really look at in the medium term. We've also looked at sort of temporary exhibitions where we've been working with external people, and some of those have been postponed into next year, and some of them will need to be reviewed when we know when we can get back into the building. In terms of reopening, we're in the shared building ourselves, so we have council support and facilities management who are working on plans. That really leaves it for us to look at our own procedures and how we set up exhibitions or how we accept donations, so we could do quite specific museum risk assessments for that. But I suppose we are in a position where we will have other people who will be able to tell us what arrangements are in place where we can feed into, as opposed to having to look at that as a whole document ourselves. So it has been a period of adjustment, but we have sort of figured out themes that we can work on, and we've planned sort of virtual content for a 6 months initially, and probably will continue that even if we're back in the building until the end of the year at least, just in relation to events and providing that content. We don't think we'll be able to have schools or events in the actual building. So that's really sort of a quick overview of where we're at the minute in relation to our work.
Thanks, Elaine. That's brilliant. It sounds like you're having to learn a lot and change things very, very quickly, and you seem to be extremely busy, like I guess lots of us who aren't furloughed. But thanks so much for that. So next up we have Jenny.
Okay, so I manage the Northern Ireland War Memorial, so I suppose I can give an overview of how a small independent museum is dealing with the crisis. We're quite fortunate that we're not depending on admission fees, though our source of income, which is investments, has taken a hit, so we have to keep an eye on that. As a charity and an independent museum with a very small management team, the main challenge for us has been balancing that front of house engagement with all the background work, for example, HR, reading reams of information on the furlough scheme and trying to keep staff supported, and also making sure we're communicating with our trustees who are older people, and there's some technology barriers there. So juggling all of that in a small team is difficult, but also we've been able to really advance some really interesting engagement projects because we are a small team, and you know, when we have our ideas, our trustees trust us to go forward with them. So the easiest thing has actually been the engagement side of things, getting staff set up for safe working at home, changing our engagement plans, cancelling everything we had planned for VE Day. So those of you who've been to the War Memorial will know that we tell the story of the Second World War, so that was a massive thing for us. I won't bore you with all the details and what we had to cancel, and what we ended up doing is similar to what a lot of museums throughout Northern Ireland did and are doing. We worked with the BBC and the Education Authority to film a series of workshops for primary school children. We've created a huge amount of learning resources online. We transformed our singing reminiscence workshop, which we normally offer in the museum once a month, into a sing-along CD, because like Elaine, we're finding that the care homes that we would normally work with, they don't all have Wi-Fi or that kind of knowledge, so we had to opt for a CD. We've sent that out to every care home in Northern Ireland, which has gone down really well. NIMC have supported us to offer our Love to Move, which is like a reminiscence and movement session in care homes virtually. So we've started doing that, which is going really well. We're testing out virtual workshops with primary schools. I'm beginning to think of the reality of reopening. And as Maggie said, we all will reopen, but it'll never really seem the same again. We have to offer something different. So we're starting to think about what we can offer for schools when they might not be able to travel to us. And we've explored as many partnerships as possible, sent out many "can you help us" emails or "would you be willing" emails. We sort of dealt with the crisis by jumping in with lots of creative ideas. And if I'm honest, it's been the background work that's been harder for me, you know, making sure all of our HR is up to scratch as well. So I suppose, to summarise, we're dealing with the crisis by listening to our audiences, being transparent about the challenges and the opportunities, communicating with our board, thinking about what we can offer our visitors, especially home learners, being mindful of those who are not online, reaching out to the media and stepping out of our comfort zones. I've done 2 interviews in my garden so far, and I've been filmed doing a cook-along in my kitchen, making the most of our social media platforms, creating new content, supporting freelancers. We've worked with a few artists who have made YouTube videos for us, so it's been really good to support them at this time. We did some socially distanced collections photography. We are going to try to do some socially distanced conservation as well, trying to see what we can still do to support those people who work in the sector freelance, and creating resources which are relevant and useful. So yeah, that's sort of a run through of what we've done. And as I said, working in a small museum, it's meant that our ideas have taken off quickly and we've been able to provide access to the collection. Reopening plans, I mean, that's just a minefield, but I'm really glad that we have the support from the MA, from the Northern Ireland Museums Council, and from just our meetups with other museum managers, just talking about what we need to do and think about for reopening.
Thanks so much, Jenny. That was fantastic. Some really great projects going on there. It'd be good to hear more about some of those. And also interesting to think about the board element and sort of governance, which is an interesting issue during times of crisis. It obviously came up in our coronavirus conversation last week to do with leadership. So thanks so much, Jenny. So next up we have, I'm trying to do my alphabet, Catherine. Welcome, Catherine. Great you're here. Off you go.
Well, thank you very much, Simon, and thanks very much to the MA for inviting me, and hello everybody who's listening. In particular, I'd just like to say hello to any of my colleagues who are listening in, because these are very difficult times and I miss you all. So I'm quite sure you don't miss me, but I miss you. So I do really appreciate this opportunity to speak to you. I suppose from a National Museums NI perspective, what's the impact been on our organisation? Well, as like all museums, when you're set up to make your collections accessible to the widest possible audience, it's pretty devastating not to be able to open your doors and let people in. And with our museum split over 3 sites plus our off-site stores, it was hugely complex exercise in shutting everything down and having to do it extremely fast. But I would say that as an organisation, I think that we have coped extremely well. I think at times like these, you really appreciate the people that you work with, and there's an absolutely fantastic team of people at National Museums in Northern Ireland, and to see how we have coped as an organisation and what we've been doing for audiences, I think has been really inspiring for me. I suppose as a director, my most immediate concerns are the financial challenge that we're facing this year, which is not unlike anybody else. We seek are looking at losing around £2.5 to £3 million of self-generated income this year, and that has been of huge concern to us. We had to fight really hard, as did a number of national museums, to be able to access the furlough scheme, and that has been a great opportunity for us. And we have currently got 55% of our staff on furlough, which has allowed us to get a rebate that will help to offset that loss. I think as well, we want to get open as soon as possible, but we're also aware of the challenges of reopening and the complexity around that. So there is really huge amounts of planning going into our reopening so that we are safe for our colleagues to return to work, but also safe for the public. And I guess we'll do it, like everybody will do it. We all have to open our doors. We'll all be able to welcome people back in. I think some of the concerns that I might have is, are we going to get people back through the doors? And there's been a lot of sentiment research done by a whole range of different organisations. And I know certainly from a National Museum perspective, we're probably looking at a significantly reduced footfall. We could have maybe only 30% of our regular visitors. Obviously, what has been a concern throughout and will continue to be is the health and well-being of our staff and the availability of people to work, because it's likely in a corona world we'll need a greater resource to open museums and make sure that everybody is welcomed. And I think it's really important that when we do welcome people back in the museum, that we're not reinforcing fear and the fear that people have had, but that actually we are welcoming them back with a warmth and an opportunity to come and have a really positive experience in the museums. And as well, I suppose for me, longer term, our financial viability will continue to be a significant concern. And I suppose particularly within Northern Ireland, I do worry about the status of the culture, heritage and arts sector. I think it's a sector that, regardless of whether it's funded by central government or local government, has suffered huge amounts of reductions in funding, and we are in a very vulnerable position, particularly as we have been pushed to depend and to generate more of our own income. And I think that while we can and do provide significant value to society, particularly from an economic and social impact perspective, that that is not well recognised. And also, when health, our primary responsibility is firefighting and education's primary responsibility is firefighting, it's hard to argue for the value that we can bring to those agendas, albeit that in the medium to long term, that culture and heritage will help deliver results for those sectors. So I do think as we have gone through this process, I think we have worked really hard to stay connected with audiences, and particular, like Jenny and Elaine have said, it's for us been about how do we create meaningful content online, because social media has just been flooded. I think the team at National Museums in Northern Ireland has been hugely creative in terms of what they do. We've had everything from creator blogs, and particularly at our outdoor sites, we've been able to really route our social media back into the collections rather than what events are happening and what's going to be coming up next. And I think there's huge value in that. We've been able to take our Florence Nightingale exhibition, which we've done online, which was a first for us. We were able to do Bluegrass live. So the Bluegrass Festival obviously wasn't able to happen in Oma, but we've been able to do it live. And most recently, the Culture Lab exhibition at the Ulster Museum, which is a part of our Making the Future programme, has now gone online, and that has taken the very popular Dairy Girls quiz that we had in the gallery to test how Catholic or Protestant you are in the world of Dairy Girls, and it's interesting to see where that's gone. And we think it's moving around expat communities around the world, so it's been accessed in America, Australia, across Europe. So that's really good to see as well, because it's a very important theme and topic and as part of our, I guess, our programming. I suppose for me, the biggest question, because we will get through this, we will all get through this, we'll come out the other end. And I think what we need to keep focused on is where will our sector be in the next 12 to 18 months? Where will our sector be in two years' time? And I think as a sector, there's a real challenge to us to reimagine what the future will look like and what our offer will look like for audiences. As many of you will know who are familiar with National Museums, we have been on a journey of transformation over the last number of years. that we have to almost redouble our efforts in that respect and challenge ourselves again as to where we're going. But I think that this coronavirus has probably had a very profound effect on society and a profound effect on people and what people value. And I think that for us, across all of our sites, it's about reconnecting with our core purpose and reconnecting with the collections and having a much more local focus. International visitors are not going to come back to these shores for probably quite some time. I think the Tourist Board are forecasting it could be up to 2 years before we get anywhere near 2019 figures. So the local market is going to become really important, but also we tend to measure our success on how many visitors we get through the door. And I think that we need to look at what the metrics are that to value what we do. And to me, just given where I think society's at, this is about making much deeper and more profound and meaningful connections with a much more diverse audience. So as well as having a focus on local, I think that for us, the priority has to absolutely be about access, inclusion and diversity in our audiences. If you look at our metrics to date, we want to be museums for all, and we believe that we're museums for all, but we're not currently museums for all if you look at the demographic of our audience, and I think that needs to be a real priority for us. I think reviewing our business model is going to be critical because we need to see what's going to be appropriate in terms of how we operate into the future. And I suppose the last thing I'll say, because I appreciate I probably rambled on a bit, Simon, and you're already running over and you're going, everyone shut up. But I think the other big consideration for us is what is our programming priority? What are our programming priorities going to be? And what themes are going to be important for us based on audiences? And I suppose for us, some of the themes that we think we need to really do a lot or ramp up and focus on are, we have a really big natural science collection. So what can we do to support the agenda around environmental sustainability? And, I think that's very pertinent to where we are today. But also for our society here in Northern Ireland, the biggest issue we have is around, aside from coronavirus, is around identity and cultural expression. And a lot of the work that we've been doing over the last couple of years is really focused on our contemporary history. And I think there's a lot more that we can be doing within that space. So that was a bit of a ramble, but hopefully that answered the questions that you were asking of me. On a personal level, how have I coped? As I said, Anna, I'll just say, I did an Alpha webinar last week or a couple of weeks ago, and I've survived with my holy trinity. That's my bike. I've done over 800 miles on my bike. My daily swim in the sea and gin. Perfect.
Sounds perfect. Thanks so much, Catherine. Thanks for sharing the challenges and opportunities and thinking about that longer term view of where we might be further ahead in 1 year, 2 years. It's really interesting and to think about. So thanks for waiting. Ada, you're up next. I'm really interested to hear your views. Obviously, you've got a view across the sector. So if you could unmute yourself, Sinead, and then, yeah, off you go.
Okay, thanks, Simon, and good afternoon, everyone. Yes, I mean, the how museums, the local museums across Northern Ireland have really dealt with the crisis has been very much dependent and reflective really of their capacity and their resources. So for example, the local council museums have probably been the most visible simply because they're sitting within a larger framework. The National Trust, of which we have 7 member organisations, member museums, they furloughed quite early on, so they have been present and visible, particularly on social media, but on a Northern Ireland regional basis. And in the independent museums, with the exception of very few, they have probably been the most silent. Jenny in the Northern Ireland War Memorial has been very visible. But that again is a reflection on the fact of really the capacity of the organisations, the resources, and how quickly or how later on people actually furloughed staff. However, across the sector we have been, there have been a number of changes as a result of lockdown. So for example, 5 to 6 museums have initiated contemporary collecting policies or projects. So for example, Newry and Mourne are working on living in lockdown, and Lisbon Museum, COVID-19 and me. So that's been quite they started very early and has been quite innovative. A lot of museums have increased their social media activity to make sure that connection has stayed with different audiences, has stayed in place. And probably one of the most outstanding ones for me is Fermanagh County Museum, who have a really engaging project around mystery objects, which has a lot of people, local people, interacting with it. But also they're using Facebook to show Fermanagh films, and they're working with MI Screen on that. Other museums have initiated online engagement projects, such as Carrickfergus Museum. And also we discussed quite early on, and Jenny and Elaine have already mentioned it, that we would fund Love to Move online, the online version. So Mid Antrim Museum, Northern Ireland War Memorial and the Tower Museum are involved with that. And I think, as Elaine or maybe Jenny had mentioned, it's actually going very well so far. And that's been in some ways a surprise for us, because we weren't expecting to move, to have that access to care homes so early on. But actually, and I think Jenny would agree, it has worked. We have also been involved with those nationwide campaigns and international campaigns, and a lot of the local museums have connected with us, and we have been reposting and retweeting. So Alistair mentioned the BBC's initiative, Museum from Home, and also we made a point of going for hashtag Museum Week 2020 and International Museums Day. For us as Museums Council, it's been quite important to make sure that we're connecting the museum community in Northern Ireland. So we quite early on moved our training programme online, and that has been very successful. In some cases, we're having to repeat training just to keep up with the demand. And that is happening now on a monthly basis and is free to NIMC members. We're collaborating currently with the Association of Independent Museums. And initially that started as an exercise just really with those independent museums who were members of AIM and who wanted advice, support, business resilience and business support advice. And I have since extended that to all the independent museums. So we're now having 2 different sessions around governance and fundraising. Today actually is governance, next week is fundraising. We also set up a museums, and I think Jenny alluded to it there, a museum managers group. And we're having the second meeting this coming Friday, and that's become quite a forum for discussion about really reopening, because there's so many questions around reopening. And I was in the meeting this morning with workforce, and it's great to hear that the guidelines hopefully will be coming out, BCMS via the National Museums Directors Council, hopefully this week, maybe next week. We have also been working with the Arts Council for Northern Ireland on an emergency organisations fund. Now that is really only available to the independent museums who are part of the Northern Ireland Museums Council, and the deadline for that is this Friday, and that enables people to apply for funding up to 25,000. So that's good. And then we are ongoing, just working with Museum Development Network at the moment, trying to attract additional funding that we can then offer to the local museums in Northern Ireland. But the conversation has started really about obviously reopening, when's that likely to be, and all the big questions around the cost of reopening, and is it going to be viable for some museums for the first while at all.
Brilliant.
That's all for me, Simon.
Thanks so much, Sinead. That was a really great overview of all the different things going on. I think we've actually run out of time, sadly. So we'll have to stop there, unfortunately. But I think it's true to say, whatever happens, we'll probably have these meetings more regularly now. So it'd be good to do it again, and maybe programme in a bit more time for questions. We had Paddy Gilmore asked about business models, and I think that's been touched upon by a few of you, and Gina from the IMA was also asking about the reopening guidelines. I think Gina's question's been answered as well. But thanks so much. It was lovely to see you all, and yeah, we should do this again soon. Just a few things before we sign off. A quick reminder that there's another opportunity to take part in an MA webinar next week. The Coronavirus Conversations on Workforce next week, so you can sign up on the website on that. Please do feedback today on how you thought today's event went. It was obviously the first time we've done this, and it'd be good to learn from the experience. And finally, I'd just like to thank all the speakers, particularly last four. It's really interesting to hear your insights. And thanks to everyone else for attending. See you all soon.
Bye.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
Bye.